They are the highest-ranked two-loss team in college football, the Ole Miss Rebels, with an impressive resume in the SEC Western Division, and they take on the rejuvenated Arkansas Razorbacks, who finally broke through after so many close calls in the SEC to win for Brett Bielema in his first SEC victory against LSU last week. We bring in Zac Ellis of SI.com to help us break down the Hogs hosting the Rebels this week. Zac, thanks so much for joining us. This Ole Miss football team's been very impressive this season, especially considering they go to Death Valley. They lose it because Bo Wallace kind of loses his head in the last few seconds, tries to go for the victory downfield in the end zone. And then that Auburn game, a couple fumbles right at the goal line, or they probably defeated the Tigers, and this team could really be talking national championship. But at this point, an extremely solid team, and that defense has been rock solid, locked down since game one.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about a team, you're saying the highest ranked two-loss team, and this was kind of, Ole Miss was kind of the darling of kind of the country for a while, and suddenly it seems like, they've been kind of forgotten just because of two pretty big losses to LSU and Auburn. Then they go last week and play Presbyterian, but as far as on a national stage, I mean, yeah, you're right. They've really kind of fallen off as far as expectations are concerned, but it's been the defense, like you said. That defense has been one of the best, not just in the SEC, but in the whole country. We saw it in key situations like that Alabama game a few weeks ago in the fourth quarter where they kind of shut down the Tide. And, now we'll see if they can handle a pretty good running game with Arkansas this week.
What's impressive about the defense is just to watch these guys play. It's a cohesive unit. They're solid up front, obviously, with Kemditi leading the way, Shackelford as well. The secondary's extremely talented as well. And if you just look at the performance and the results in a day and age when offenses are running loose and good defenses are just trying to maintain a score under 30 points, they are just simply locking teams down. Alabama scoring 17 points on them. They go to Kyle Field and hold Texas A&M to 6 points until a couple garbage touchdowns late. So really nobody has scored points in droves against this Rebels defense. They've been extremely good. And they get Cody Pruitt, one of the best safeties in college football, back this week from a shoulder injury. So they really need to line up against this Arkansas running game. Hugh Freeze mentioned it this week that maybe this isn't necessarily the best matchup because we've got a speed defense. LSU exposed us to a certain extent, rushing for 264 on the ground with Leonard Fournette and company. So Ole Miss is going to have to kind of dig in its heels against this Arkansas running game.
Yeah, and you touched on how it's kind of hard to tell exactly what the best part of that defense is. They've got a great front seven, but they've also got a really, really good secondary that I think is one of the best when it comes to interceptions. Inquest Golson on his own, I think, has 8 or 9, might lead the SEC. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You talked about the offenses and the passing games and whatnot. I mean, they've been able to shut that down, but going against a rushing team like this Arkansas team is going to be key for that defensive front. I mean, guys like C.J. Johnson have to be huge for them because we know what Arkansas can do. We know what guys like Alex Collins, Jonathan Williams can do with the ball in their hands. They've won games where quarterback Brendan Allen has attempted like 10 passes. So I mean, it's a very you're not going to be confused on what their strategy is going to be. But this defense has kind of answered the call so far for most of its issues, but can they handle a serious running game here? We saw them be able to handle Alabama in the past, or at least get past them because of that defense. But you also see an Alabama team that tends to go to the air more, maybe in the fourth quarter, than a team like Arkansas would. So can that front seven step up against Alex Collins and Jonathan Williams? On the road, that's going to be key.
Yeah, Zach, saying on that Arkansas storyline on the offensive side of the football before we get back to the Rebels. Brett Bielema's had to revamp this roster, and he's obviously still in the midst of doing so, but at the same time, he fell into a situation with the offensive front, and especially the two guys you mentioned, Alex Collins and Jonathan Williams, two of the more powerful backs in college football. They've come into this game both with 11 touchdowns, so he at least had that in place as his comfort level. What he loves to do is line it up in the I formation, run the football downhill, and these guys have made it easy for him to at least do what he likes to do offensively.
Right. I mean, not a bad situation to walk into if you're Brett Bielema coming from a Wisconsin team, Big Ten, that we know what they were going to do, and he's trying to turn that, like you talk about, he's trying to turn this Arkansas team into that kind of same situation, running between the tackles, running downhill, has a pretty good offensive line, a quarterback that can make the plays if necessary at times, not always. He can make mistakes, but make no mistake about it, they run the ball, and that's what they've been trying to do pretty much for Bielema's whole time there, and that was key for them last week. I think too, it's been that way for every game they've had, and I think we saw, especially this season, you kind of felt like that upset was going to come in the SEC. We saw them almost get by Alabama. I mean, we saw parts of the issue where like we know he's going to get his first SEC win, and the running game is a big part of that. So if you're Brett Bielema, I think this is exactly what you were looking for when trying to implement your system and the kind of football that you want, because he's one of those guys that is publicly against like the fast-paced offenses that you see out there in the spreads and whatnot. He likes to have the old school football. He likes to have the running between the tackles, and it works for him. So if he can install that with the players that he had kind of had at a place like Wisconsin, where I think he went to 3 straight Rose Bowls. I mean, we know what he's able to do, and he's kind of got that there. But can they handle one of the best defenses that you're going to see, not just in the SEC, but in the entire country this week?
Zach, you mentioned Brandon Allen. He's a quarterback who doesn't have the workload of other quarterbacks around the SEC, as you mentioned, but at the same time, you've got to be able to set up the play action and have to deliver downfield. He's a guy that I've got some Arkansas people who said his shoulder wasn't right all of last season. He hurt it diving into the end zone against Southern Miss. Only completed like 47% of his passes against the SEC, although the stats look better overall, again, against the SEC, bad touchdown-to-pick ratio. I expected at some point this season to see his brother possibly in the lineup, a recruit that they brought in, as well as, I believe, Rafe Peavy, top Missouri quarterback. But it's been Brandon Allen from start to finish. Saw the last couple drives against Mississippi State when they had upset on their mind. They were close to pulling off a game in Starkville, and he threw the pick that clinched it for Mississippi State, although he moved it up and down the field with Hunter Henry, one of the best tight ends in the country. So just your thoughts about Brandon Allen and whether he can finish this out, and your evaluation of his performance.
Well, I covered the SEC Media Days in Birmingham in July, and talking to a lot of the Arkansas players, that was kind of a constant with them, is that, remember, Brandon Allen was hurt last year. This wasn't the Brandon Allen that we know he can be. We know he can be a little bit more effective, and we've seen that at times this year, but you're right. I still want to see times like against Mississippi State where the ball's in his hands to make a play and it still comes up a little short. If Ole Miss is able to stop that run game, it's going to come on him to complete some 3rd and longs at times when they otherwise might not have to, and that's going to be key for them. He's been a little bit more effective this year, and they've put all their faith in him at times, but he's also had a very, very good running game to lean on. So while he has looked a little more effective, there are times like you talked about the Mississippi State game where the ball's in his hands, and he still is able to come a little bit short. So that's the real wild card here. Is if suddenly they're not able to get the running game off the ground, can he make enough plays to at least move the chains, and keep that defense honest, and know that he has that ability to do that? Because if they're not afraid of him, then they're just gonna stack the box as it happens, and that's how it goes for them. So we'll see what happens with that. But he's looked a lot better than last year, and they say he's healthy, and it seems to look that way. But there are still moments where he isn't as effective as they need him to be, but he needs to be that against this defense.
Yeah, it's hard to judge the psyche of any football team, but you would have to consider this team probably the best 5-5 team in the country, maybe along with Tennessee, who we talked about earlier, or possibly Stanford. They finally break through in the SEC. So do we see a letdown this week because the reins are off and they continue to celebrate from the LSU game? Or do they play a freer style of football and just cut it loose because they're not in the last few minutes of a tight game thinking we've never done this, we've never pulled it out in the SEC, and we've got Alabama at 14-13, or we've got another game like Texas A&M where they had a 2-touchdown lead in the second half and couldn't hang out. They finally were able to pull through against a good team and get it done. That we might see Arkansas really not explode. I think they've got so much work to do on that roster, but play much better against quality competition.
Yeah, I mean, I think Arkansas is a very good example of a team that you look at its record and it doesn't completely tell the story of what that team is capable of. And I mean, you wonder if this Arkansas team wasn't in the SEC West. I mean, what if they were in the East right now? Surely you'd have to look at them as probably one of the favorites in that division, or at least have played pretty well so far. But yeah, I think they've just had some tough draws at times, and the West has been deeper for most of the year, maybe not today, but for most of the year than people expected it to be with the two Mississippi teams. But I think even being at home, I think being at home is very big for them this weekend and keeping it close. But I'm just not sure I'm convinced that they can handle that defensive front of what Ole Miss can bring. Because I think if it comes to Brendan Allen passing the ball, it's going to be tough against guys like you talked about, Cody Pruitt, Sinquez Golson, Tony Connor. I mean, these are guys that are very very effective in the passing game when it comes to ball hawking, and I think it's going to be tough for them even being at home. But the key is going to be for them on the defensive side of the ball too, to force Bo Wallace into some mistakes, because he's a guy too that's really defined his career by making mistakes when he shouldn't have. I mean, you looked at the LSU game a few weeks ago. I mean, that pass at the end of the game was not even the pass that Hugh Freeze wanted them to make. He wanted to throw it at the end of the sideline and take it out of bounds and get a closer field goal. But sometimes it's good Bo and bad Bo is what they always talk about, and Bo Wallace doesn't like to talk about that. But if the defense can maybe limit him to some mistakes, they can stay in this one. But I'm just not sure that Arkansas has the two-dimensional game for 4 quarters to handle that Ole Miss defense. So I think Ole Miss gets away with this one, but I do think they keep it close just because of what we've seen Ole Miss do the last couple of weeks in a few letdown situations.
Yeah, the Ole Miss offense much better and as you mentioned, multi-dimensional compared to Arkansas. At the same time, this is a team that's in the lower tier of the rushing ranks in the SEC. They lose Laquan Treadwell as he makes the valiant effort to get to the goal line against Auburn. He's their number one guy. They're pretty well stocked at wide receiver, so I'm not that concerned. But we have yet to see them against a quality opponent since Treadwell went down. And again, the running game has nothing is not a dominant force for them, and so it goes back to Bo Wallace.
Yeah, and I think in a way Bo Wallace is like a Brendan Allen, except he can be worse or better at both things. So he can be a little bit more dangerous with his interception and mistakes like Brendan Allen can, but I think that he can also be a lot more productive at times too. And that's something you look at Bo Wallace, when he's on, he's on. I mean, this year in some of the games they played, he was even having some people whisper the word Heisman out there, which is really crazy to think when you think about Bo Wallace's career and the problems that he's had when it comes to self-imposed mistakes at times, and I think I think in this game, knowing what he is capable of, we know that he can be dangerous, and this passing game can be dangerous, even without a guy like Laquan Treadwell. But you're right that sometimes the lack of a running game or a productive running game can hurt them when it comes to defense kind of knowing what they're going to do, and they know that if you rattle Bo Wallace, then he'll just throw the ball up there sometimes. But when Bo Wallace gets in a groove, he can be really dangerous. So it depends on which one shows up in this game, the good Bo or the bad Bo. Yeah, they definitely have some weapons when it comes to the passing game. It's unfortunate to not have Treadwell in a game like this and see his season go down like it did. But they're a whole new team if they can. If Bo Wallace can limit his mistakes, and if they can somehow get some semblance of a running game, I think Atavius Mathers is one of their bigger rushers there, and being able to be two-dimensional is going to be huge for them because you can't rely completely on Bo Wallace against a good defense, unfortunately, in the SEC West.
So, Zach, I'll leave you with this. If we get the expected, Alabama wins out against Auburn, they go on and they win by a couple of scores probably in the SEC West, the championship game. Otherwise, chaos ensues. If Auburn beats Alabama, then we could have all sorts of scenarios play out. Georgia, most people would consider to be the better team between them and Mizzou based on the result there. They could have a better shot against the West. You could have Auburn show up, Ole Miss, or Mississippi State, obviously, with just the one loss if they can go to Oxford and win. So in terms of the college football playoff, I don't know if you would consider this chaos or a lot of fun to see what the College Football Playoff Committee would do with a one-loss Mississippi State who doesn't win the SEC, or possibly a two-loss Georgia team pull off the upset in the West, or Ole Miss be able to break through, and you've got a glut possibly of two-loss teams in the SEC.
I think it's hard, no matter how many losses even the best SEC teams have, I think it's hard to see a situation where the SEC champion gets left out in that scenario, just because even though we don't know exactly what it is from week to week that the selection committee might value, whether it's big wins, whether it's conference championships, that's one of the things they've talked about is that conference championships matters to them. I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing, because I think there are scenarios like we've talked about in the SEC West where the best team could maybe not even be the one that emerges in Atlanta. I think in the scenario that you referred to, if Alabama goes out and loses, if you're looking at a bunch of two-loss teams there, I think whoever comes out of Atlanta as the SEC champion is still going to make it in. But if you look at Alabama winning out and Mississippi State winning out, and you're looking at a one-loss Mississippi State team, I'm not convinced that they actually do get in, just because you look at the rest of their schedule and what they've done. I mean, right now, one of their best wins would be against probably an Auburn team that's kind of reeling. Ole Miss might look better here in the next couple of weeks, but we still don't know completely. That could be a big win on the road. But one thing that's not talked about with Mississippi State a lot that really impresses me, or I guess surprises me, is that their non-conference schedule isn't really that impressive. Didn't go out and really play a huge team. Ole Miss at least went out and scheduled Boise State and Atlanta, even though Boise isn't looking what it used to be, but that's still a game they tried to schedule, and I think that might come down to hurt. If Mississippi State had stayed undefeated, they probably you wouldn't worry about it because of the SEC West, but I think with one loss, losing to what could be the potential SEC champion, I think that could hurt Ole Miss. So I'm not convinced they get in. I think we're looking at a potential of a one SEC team in the playoff right now as it stands.
Yeah, I'm completely on board with you there, Zach, because as long as Mississippi State was undefeated, especially playing in the SEC, they're not going to be questioned. They're the number one team in the country. They're going to get the nod over Florida State at the time because of Florida State's ACC schedule. Once they lost, they then get placed on that one-loss tier with everybody else, and you start to need to break down the schedules, and the out-of-conference schedule is just atrocious. Southern Miss and UAB and so forth. Nobody from the Power 5 for Mississippi State. Unfortunately, from the College Football Playoff Committee, they put themselves in a bit of a quandary by continuing to place Mississippi State by this last ranking in the top 4. So they sit at number 4, and that last win is going to be pretty impressive over a number 8 Ole Miss. And to keep them out after placing them at number 4 after the loss to Alabama, it's going to be difficult to justify jumping them after they beat the number 8 team in the country and they only have one loss.
Yeah, and if you're a TCU fan or a Baylor fan or Ohio State fan, you're probably a little frustrated right now because of that. But at the same time, I think what Jeff Long talked about last night was that the loss to Alabama looked better than maybe some losses other teams had. But I mean, if you're looking at a team like a TCU or a Baylor who have suddenly looked a lot better this year than people thought. Ohio State creeping into it after winning against Michigan State, and Ohio State could win the Big Ten title and potentially in that game beat maybe a pretty good Wisconsin team or something and sneak into it, even after losing to Virginia Tech early this year, which was crazy to think. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of the question going into these last rankings last night was, what will the committee do to Mississippi State, a team that drops out, that was number 1? Would they drop out of the top 4 altogether? And you talked about not being questioned. I think I think had they stayed undefeated, you're right, they would have been questioned. But that's actually a similar situation to me like Florida State. If Florida State's not going to be questioned, they're going to be in the top 4 if they went out and stay undefeated. But if Florida State loses a game or had lost a game, that's when people start talking about their quality wins. Because right now their quality wins are against a Notre Dame team that's suddenly kind of fallen off the horse, a Clemson team that even though Deshaun Watson's gotten injured, and they've lost, I think, 3 games now at least, they don't have that great of a schedule either. But I think the record really matters a lot in being able to stay undefeated, win a potential conference championship, which they probably will in a Power 5 conference. And it's hard to keep Florida State out. But we've already seen that this committee's kind of questioned their body of work by moving teams like a one-loss Alabama and a one-loss Oregon above them in the top 4. So I think Florida State's situation is similar to what Mississippi State's was before they lost.
Yeah, sometime we'll have to have you back, Zach, to talk about the format of this college football playoff because it's an interesting discussion. And for me, it starts with 5 conferences, 4 slots. You automatically introduce controversy into the situation as soon as you go with those numbers. So Zac Ellis joins us from SI.com. We appreciate the time. Zach, before we let you go, would love to know what you're working on this week.
Sure, I'll have a piece, I think, going up on the site this week just talking about Marshall football because, Marshall, along with Florida State, is one of the 2 undefeateds right now, but Marshall also has one of the I think that's one of the worst conference schedules right now of anybody. I mean, they don't play a Power 5 opponent this season. And I think right now they've only played one bowl eligible team, and that was Rice, who's like 6-4. So, I thought it was interesting to get their perspective at looking at this new system and how they're not. The question right now is not even if they would get into the top 4 in a New Year's Bowl. The question is, will they even be ranked in the rankings right now? Because in all the playoff rankings we've seen so far, they've yet to put a Group of 5 team in among those smaller 5 conferences. Whereas in the AP poll, Marshall was ranked 18th this year. So college football media think that Marshall is a top 20 team. The committee right now is not really convinced quite yet. So it's just an interesting dynamic going forward, and kind of looking at the system and how the small guys are still getting left out, similar to how the BCS was back then. So that should go up this week, and then we'll have game coverage this weekend, and then every week I do a Heisman watch on Mondays. So keep up with that as the Heisman race kind of heats up.
Good stuff, Zach. Appreciate the insight and information concerning this situation with the SEC West and the entire conference as we head down the stretch.
Thanks, Mark.